The air hung thick and sour with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present, grinding dust of the Arizona Territory. The year was 1883, and 19-year-old Alara Voss stood rigid as a fence post in the center of the makeshift wedding circle, the rough-spun cloth of her dress scratching her neck, a fresh, vivid reminder of her forced fate. She wasn't wearing the lace or silk she'd dreamed of, she wore a simple, sack-like dress bought with the last of her family's nearly empty safe, a garment as colorless as her future. Her father, Silas Voss, a man whose face was a road map of poor decisions and desperation, avoided her gaze, his hand white-knuckled on the brim of his stained Stetson. The entire town of Briar Creek was there, a circle of silent, judgmental faces. The women clutched their children close, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, while the men leaned on their rifles, their eyes hard and filled with a cold, territorial resentment. Alara could feel their collective contempt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. She was being bartered, an asset traded for the survival of the failing Voss ranch, and everyone present knew it, judging her for the necessity of the sacrifice and silently damning her for the choice of the buyer. The sun beat down, turning the dust into a shimmering, golden haze that did little to soften the brutal reality of the moment. The humiliation was a deeper burn than the relentless heat. The man she was forced to marry, Chayton, a leader from the fiercely independent Apache bands, a group the town called Dog Soldiers, stood opposite her. He was tall, formidable, and utterly silent, his presence a stark, powerful contrast to the pale, nervous faces of the townsfolk. He wore buckskin and traditional silver, and his eyes, dark and deep as a mountain lake, held an expression Alara couldn't decipher, not cruel, not triumphant, but something profoundly watchful and distant. His people, a small contingent of Apache riders, stood a respectful distance away, mounted and armed, their posture conveying a quiet, unnerving readiness. The tension between the two groups was a palpable, dangerous current, ready to spark into violence with the smallest wrong move or spoken word. Alara's younger sister, Lila, a girl of 15 with her own dreams of a gentle husband, began to sob, the sound a thin, helpless thread in the heavy silence. Her mother, Miriam, whose spirit had been crushed years ago by the relentless hardship of the frontier, pulled Lila closer, whispering a desperate, unheard prayer into her daughter's hair. The silence of the town was the loudest part of the ceremony, a collective, condemning roar that stripped Alara of any last shred of dignity. Silas, emboldened by a swallow of cheap rotgut, cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice cracking with false authority. "We are here," he announced to the oppressive heat and the surrounding, hostile faces, to join Alara Voss and Chayton, son of Cochise. He deliberately used the ancient, revered name, a clumsy attempt to lend weight to the transaction, in the eyes of God and this land. He was marrying his daughter to their enemy for a single, desperate reason, a treaty of peace, and more importantly, a large sum of gold that would clear his debts and buy their family a few more seasons of life. The gold, already sitting in a saddlebag on one of the Apache ponies, was the true officiant of this brutal, loveless union. Alara shut her eyes, picturing the debt ledger at the general store, the threatening notes, the starvation. This marriage was not about love, it was about survival, a grim arithmetic of human cost. The thought of that gold, stained with her future, did not bring relief, but a searing, profound resentment that she feared would never burn out. Chayton finally moved. His movement was fluid, effortless, and drew the immediate, sharp attention of every rifle-toting man in the crowd. He spoke, not in the low, guttural Apache tongue the townsfolk expected, but in clear, perfect English, his voice a surprising baritone that cut through the silence. "The words are unnecessary, Silas Voss. The agreement is known by all." He took a single step toward Alara, and she flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement that was nonetheless noted by every witness. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes meeting hers, holding a strange, non-judgmental clarity. He reached inside his buckskin vest and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box, no bigger than a woman's palm. The simple, plain box seemed out of place among the silver and rough leather he wore, an unexpected item that instantly piqued the town's silent, feverish curiosity. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, expecting a traditional Apache gift, a piece of ceremonial turquoise, perhaps a simple knife, or a protective amulet. The silence returned, thicker and more dangerous than before, as every eye in the clearing focused on the humble box in Chayton's hand. Chayton did not open the box immediately. He held it out to her, his gaze unwavering, and then he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the townsfolk huddled around the circle. His words were not an offering of love or a proclamation of duty, but a statement of simple fact, a direct, powerful challenge to the entire, judgmental audience. This is my offering. It is not for your family's debts, which are paid. This is only for you, Elara Voss. It is the price of your dignity, stolen by your father and his community. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle over Silas and the townsfolk like a blanket of shame. He placed the box carefully into Elara's trembling hands. The wood felt smooth and warm against her palm. As she looked down at the simple carving, a delicate feather, perfectly rendered, the silence of the crowd intensified, shifting from judgmental contempt to bewildered, tense curiosity. Elara slowly lifted the lid, her fingers brushing the cool brass clasp. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft, red velvet, was not gold, or jewelry, or any trinket of the Wild West. It was a single, official-looking document, folded neatly and tied with a slim piece of faded red ribbon. The crest at the top was unmistakable, and the words printed on the parchment, though difficult to read in the glaring sun, were powerful enough to stop the breath in every watcher's throat. Elara stared down at the paper, and a slow, profound understanding, a realization that would change her life and the standing of the entire community, began to dawn in her wide, disbelieving eyes. Elara's fingers, stained with the dust of the frontier, carefully untied the thin, faded red ribbon. The document unfolded with a slight crackle, and the official seal of the United States General Land Office, stark and intimidating, was clearly visible to everyone nearby. The paper was crisp, expensive linen, completely at odds with the rough, barren landscape. The crowd shifted, muttering nervously, their collective hostility momentarily replaced by a deep, communal dread. They couldn't read the official jargon from that distance, but they recognized the power it represented. Elara, her mind racing from the shock of Chayton's previous statement, scanned the bold, formal script. The air seemed to suck out of the clearing, leaving behind a vacuum of profound, breathless silence. The document wasn't a bill of sale for cattle or a promissory note. It was a land grant deed, formally signed and notarized just weeks prior. The name listed as the grantee, the new, rightful owner of the land, was not Chayton, nor was it any collective Apache name. It was simply, the township of Briar Creek. But the clause directly below the grant, the one that made Elara's breath hitch and her eyes widen with stunned comprehension, detailed a restrictive covenant, ownership of the township, its buildings, and all surrounding agricultural lands, was held in trust, subject only to the authority of a single, named individual, who was designated the official, overseer and beneficiary, of the trust. Her gaze snapped down to the scrawled signature line, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The name on the overseer line was Elara Voss. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting Chayton's across the short space. His gaze was steady, without triumph or malice, simply waiting. A wave of dizziness washed over her as the implications crashed in. This wasn't a wedding gift, it was an act of economic and social warfare, a maneuver that stripped her father of his power and handed the fate of the entire town, including the men who stood there judging her, into her own hands. The town's meager wealth was tied up entirely in the land and their ramshackle homes. If she owned the land, she owned their future. A strangled sound escaped Silas Voss's throat. He knew official documents, he had spent the last decade trying to secure his own failing title. He knew the absolute, unassailable power of that official seal. His face, usually a mask of weary bravado, crumpled into a sickly shade of gray, the reality of his daughter's sudden, terrifying elevation sinking in. The humiliation he had inflicted on her was suddenly multiplied 1,000-fold and returned to him with crushing force. The crowd finally broke its silence, a wave of agitated murmurs washing over the clearing. The men began to step forward, confused and angry, sensing the dramatic shift in power but not fully grasping the document's implications. "What is that paper, boss?" yelled a man named Jed Kellen, the owner of the general store and the man to whom Silas owed the most crushing debt. "What did you trade her for, besides your honor?" The accusation hung heavy in the air. Silas didn't answer, he couldn't. He just pointed a shaking finger at Chayton, his voice a desperate, dry whisper. He purchased it. He bought the entire township. He bought us. The truth, however, was worse than Silas's interpretation. Chayton hadn't bought it for himself, which the townsfolk could have eventually fought or contested. He had bought it for her, giving her a legal instrument that the laws of the territory would fiercely protect. Chayton finally spoke again, his voice cutting through the rising tide of fear and anger. He didn't raise it, yet every word resonated with the authority of absolute control. "Your home. Your wells. Your stores. All of it is held in trust. The beneficiary of that trust, the only person who can decide its future, is the woman you condemned here today." He turned his attention back to Alara, completely ignoring the stunned, frightened faces of the community. "Your father sold your future for gold to pay his foolish debts. I traded that same gold for your sovereignty." He reached out and gently closed the lid of the wooden box over the folded deed. "Keep it safe. It is the only true witness to your wedding." The sheer weight of his words, the public exposure of Silas's treachery, and the simultaneous, terrifying empowerment of Alara, settled over the community. They had gathered to witness her ruin, instead, they had witnessed her coronation as the most powerful person in Briar Creek. Alara felt the blood rush back to her head, replacing the shock with a sudden, intoxicating wave of clarity and strength she'd never known. This wasn't just a change in her status, it was a revolution. The men who had laughed at her father's failures, the women who had pitied her fate, the merchants who had squeezed her family dry, they were now all tenants on her land, their continued livelihood dependent on her silent decision. She looked at her father, who was now weeping silent, bitter tears of utter defeat, and then to her mother and Lila, whose expressions had shifted from despair to a dawning, fragile hope. Finally, she met Chayton's gaze, her eyes searching for the hidden motive, the trap in this incredible gift. But his expression remained a cool, respectful blankness. He gave a sharp, formal nod, the gesture of a partner, not a possessor. Then, without another word or glance back at the horrified townsfolk, he mounted his horse, gave a quiet command in Apache, and the small contingent of riders turned and disappeared into the relentless, golden dust cloud of the Arizona sunset, leaving Alara alone, framed by the dying light, holding the future of the entire town in her small, dust-covered hands. The town was silenced, yes, but not by fear, by an overwhelming, terrifying astonishment that she was the only one left with the power to speak. Alara stood paralyzed for a long moment, the simple wooden box heavy in her hands, her mind reeling from the unbelievable audacity of Chayton's exit. The dust cloud kicked up by the Apache riders settled slowly, shrouding the clearing in a fine, ochre veil that mirrored the cloud of confusion and terror gripping the townsfolk. The silence that followed Chayton's departure was not merely a lack of sound, it was the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute financial and political ruin for every man present. Jed Kellen, the general store owner, the man who held Silas Voss's most crushing notes, finally broke the spell. His face, usually florid and confident, was pale and damp with sweat. He stumbled forward, ignoring Silas's defeated form, his eyes locked on the box in Alara's hand. "Alara, what is that madness? What did the heathen trick you into signing?" "That land is covered by our patents," he stammered, his voice choked with rising panic. He knew, instinctively, that the Apache leader, for all his perceived savagery, had just played a card far cleaner and more decisive than any hand dealt in the territory's crooked land offices. He understood that a federally issued land grant deed, properly filed and certified, trumped every handshake, every local patent, and every unkept promise in the lawless West. His entire business, his future, was literally built on the shifting sand now owned by the girl he had always dismissed as Silas's pretty, empty-headed daughter. Ilara's own shock began to give way to a cold, thrilling clarity. She looked at Jed, the man who had overcharged her mother for flour, who had called her father a degenerate debtor, who had refused them credit even for medicine, and saw only a desperate, groveling tenant. The fear in his eyes was intoxicating, a powerful antidote to years of humiliation. She closed the box with a sharp, decisive click that echoed loudly in the tense clearing. "It is no trick, Mr. Kellen," her voice was low, surprisingly steady, stripped of the timid deference she had always shown him. "It is the deed to Briar Creek. And it is mine." She didn't elaborate, refusing to offer the satisfying explanation the town craved. The ambiguity was her greatest weapon. She turned to her mother, Miriam, who had a hand clapped over her mouth, tears of stunned relief now replacing the tears of despair. "Mother, Lila," Ilara commanded, her tone brooking no argument, "we are leaving. We will go back to the ranch." She then looked pointedly at her father, Silas, who was still slumped on a nearby hitching post, ruined. "As for you, father, you may come with us, but you will remember that you no longer own the ground you stand on. Nor do you own your daughter." That single statement severed the chain of ownership her father had tragically forged, defining the new terms of their relationship with brutal honesty. As they began to walk away, a few of the younger, hotter-headed ranch hands started to protest, their hands moving towards their sidearms. "You can't just claim our homes. You're still an Apache's wife," yelled Toby Rance, a man known for his mean streak and low intelligence. Ilara stopped without turning, pausing mid-step on the dusty path. The movement was small but arrested the entire scene. She was no longer just the rancher's daughter, she was the silent owner of their livelihood, and they felt the power of that authority in the very core of their fear. "I am the wife of Chayton, yes," Ilara said, the word wife feeling strange and sharp on her tongue. "But my marriage contract was not a trade for land. It was a trade for a single, public act of respect, a demonstration of my sovereignty that you, Mr. Rance, and this entire town, have stripped from me year after year." She turned her head slightly so she could see him from the corner of her eye, a slow, predatory calculation in her gaze. "And as for claiming your homes, read the deed. The purchase was filed weeks ago. The taxes are paid through next year. I own your foundation. I am no longer your neighbor, Mr. Rance. I am your landlord." The sheer audacity of the secret deal, that Chayton had not just paid her father's debt but had simultaneously acquired the entire township's title, spoke to a level of foresight and deep planning the townsfolk were incapable of. They had always dismissed the Apache as simple, savage raiders, incapable of navigating the complex, deceitful bureaucracy of the territorial government. But Chayton had done more than raid, he had outlawyered them all, leveraging their own system against them. This revelation carried a greater, deeper terror than any threat of violence. Violence could be met with more violence, but a legal, government-issued land deed was immutable in the eyes of the law. The town was suddenly grappling not with a physical threat, but with an existential one. Their entire concept of who was powerful and who was powerless had been violently overturned in a single, silent gift. The question that clawed at everyone's mind was, why? Why would an Apache give up such power, buying an entire settlement just to immediately hand it over to the white woman he had just married? The true answer lay in the ghost of an older, unspoken debt that ran deeper than Silas Voss's insolvency. Years ago, before Ilara was born, Chayton's younger sister, Ayana, had been gravely injured during a territorial skirmish. She had been left behind, near death, and only one person in the entire valley had possessed the courage and the basic medical knowledge to treat her wounds and send her back to her people, defying the town's fervent anti-Apache sentiment, Miriam Voss, Ilara's mother. Miriam had risked everything, her life, her home, her family's standing, to save the young woman. This act, buried and forgotten by Miriam, had been etched into the unbreakable honor code of Chayton's family. The townsfolk knew nothing of this debt of life, only the public debt of gold and the resulting humiliation. As Alara led her mother and weeping sister away from the silent, terrified assembly, the true motive of the wedding gift, to pay a debt of honor to the mother by granting absolute security and power to the daughter, remained a silent, deeply complex secret, the real reason why Chayton had simply walked away after handing over the deed. The gold paid the immediate debt, the land grant was the profound, final repayment of the debt of life. The walk back to the Voss Ranch, a dilapidated structure clinging stubbornly to the dust-choked edge of the territory, was conducted in an electric, profound silence. Alara led the way, the wooden box containing the town's fate tucked securely under her arm, the silence of the path far more unsettling than the open hostility of the town. Lila, her eyes red-rimmed but now glistening with awe, walked close behind her, occasionally brushing her hand against Alara's skirt as if seeking reassurance that the unbelievable power was real. Miriam, her face etched with the years of silent sacrifice and now, sudden, overwhelming relief, watched her eldest daughter with a mixture of pride and dawning apprehension. She knew the weight of this gift, recognizing the debt Chayton had repaid, and she feared the crushing burden of expectation and the inevitable venom the town would now direct at Alara. The gold had been a simple exchange, the land grant was a life sentence of responsibility and constant vigilance. She knew that the fear in Briar Creek would curdle quickly into a vengeful rage, and Alara, for all her new power, was fundamentally still a 19-year-old girl in a territory that respected only brute strength and established lineage. The most dramatic change was in Silas. He shuffled behind them, his shoulders slumped, the cheap whiskey offering no comfort now. The man who had once demanded obedience through bluster and familial obligation was now a ghost of himself, his entire identity as a ranch owner and head of the family brutally stripped away. He tried once to speak, to offer some pathetic, rambling justification for selling his daughter. Alara, I didn't know he'd do this. I thought he was just paying the debt, he mumbled, kicking at a loose stone. Alara stopped and turned, fixing him with a stare that was colder and sharper than any she had ever dared give him. You sold my future, father. The fact that the buyer was more honorable than the seller is your final shame. Her voice was calm, utterly devoid of hysteria or tears, and that calm was more devastating than any shout. She wasn't seeking revenge, she had simply moved past him, rendering him irrelevant. He realized, with a sickening lurch of the stomach, that she was entirely correct. He was a debtor living on his daughter's charity, and his desperate choice had elevated her beyond his reach forever. He was a silent, living monument to his own failure, and his humiliation was complete. That evening, the first signs of Alara's quiet reign of terror began. She did not raise taxes, she did not evict anyone. She merely issued a single, typewritten notice, nailed to the door of the now-closed general store, the only communication for the entire town. The notice stated, effective immediately, all outstanding debts held against Silas Voss are cancelled, paid in full by the new owner of the land, Alara Voss. Furthermore, the lease agreement for all tenants residing in the township of Briar Creek will be provided in person, at the Voss Ranch, starting tomorrow at dawn. All essential services, water access, communal grazing rights, are suspended until said leases are signed. This was a masterstroke of control. By canceling her father's debt, she stripped Jed Kellen of his primary leverage and authority in the community, crippling his business and establishing her as the ultimate arbiter of all finances. By demanding they come to her, not in the neutral ground of the town square, but at her ruined ranch, she forced the town leaders to abandon their pride and come begging, crossing the threshold of the home they had watched slowly starve. The first to arrive at dawn were Jed Kellen and Barnaby Cobb, the blacksmith, two men whose opinions held the most sway in Briar Creek. They arrived separately, nervous and clearly having slept little. Alara, dressed in a simple, clean dress, met them not in the dusty yard, but in the small, rarely used parlor of the ranch house, which Miriam had frantically cleaned and prepared. She sat behind the only sturdy table, a single oil lamp burning despite the early sun, casting the room in a formal, intimidating gloom. She had the town deed spread out, along with a stack of pre-prepared, official-looking lease agreements. Jed tried bluster, leaning his considerable weight on the table. You can't stop our water, girl. "We'll riot," he threatened, his voice shaking. Elara simply met his eyes, her expression utterly detached. "The legal documents state that all access is conditional on the owner's terms. Do you deny the legality of this deed, Mr. Kellen?" she asked softly, tapping the official seal. "If so, you will address the United States Land Office in Santa Fe, not me. Until then, you are trespassing on private property. Sign the lease, or move off the land." The leases were not financially crippling, but they were surgically humiliating. The blacksmith's lease required him to provide 4 weeks of free labor annually, exclusively for the upkeep and repair of the Voss Ranch property. Jed Kellen's lease required him to sell all essential goods, including flour and medicine, to the Voss family at wholesale cost, an agreement that cut into his profits and acknowledged his inferior position. Every lease contained a clause that was the real dagger: the tenant agrees to respect the peace and security of the Voss family and any of its associates, and acknowledges that any act of violence, defamation, or public hostility against the owner or her designated family/associates constitutes a breach of contract resulting in immediate and non-negotiable eviction. This clause gave Elara the legal right to silence the entire town, ensuring that their fear of eviction would outweigh their hatred for her new status as Chayton's wife. She forced them to sign, not with a pen, but with the full, grinding weight of the law, ensuring they would never again speak ill of her or her people. By midday, Barnaby and Jed had signed, their faces pale with defeat, realizing they had been beaten not by a rifle, but by a piece of paper and the silent, terrifying resolve of the young woman they had all underestimated. The weeks following the lease signings were defined by a tense, fragile peace in Briar Creek. The townspeople, bound by fear of eviction, ceased their open hostility and returned to their routines, but the silence was poisoned. Every glance at Elara was heavy with resentful respect, a dangerous mix of hatred and dependence. Elara, adapting with a speed that surprised even her mother, took up the mantle of power with cold, strategic efficiency. She spent her days poring over the land deed and the accompanying maps, memorizing the boundaries of her territory and the locations of the precious, finite water sources that sustained the community. Her mind, once filled with the simple domestic dreams of a frontier girl, was now consumed by property rights, leverage, and the harsh arithmetic of survival. He did not seek to destroy the town, she sought to control it, ensuring that its continued existence was predicated entirely on the respect and security of the Voss family. The power was intoxicating, replacing the gnawing fear that had defined her childhood. She found herself thriving in the cold, clear air of command, a realization that was both unsettling and profoundly empowering. However, the question of Chayton and the Apache remained the great, unsettling silence at the heart of her new life. He was her husband, yet he was an absence, a ghost who had bequeathed her an empire and then vanished into the vast, indifferent desert. He had paid a debt to her mother, elevated her to sovereignty, and then left her to bear the terrifying weight of that power alone. She knew, with the instinctive clarity of the frontier, that his gift was not free. An Apache act of honor was a complete, perfect circle, and the other side of that circle remained unclosed. What did he expect in return? Was she a puppet ruler, a placeholder for his inevitable return? Or was this freedom, this control over the white settlement, the full extent of his demand? This uncertainty was a constant, low-burning fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a waiting rider, every distant dust cloud a signal of his return to collect the unseen, final cost of his magnificent wedding gift. She never spoke of him, and her family, sensing the danger of the subject, followed her lead. Chayton became the silent partner, the invisible, looming threat that kept the town in line, a name invoked only by the fearful imaginations of her new tenants. One evening, nearly a month after the wedding, a single rider appeared at the edge of the ranch property as the sun bled a violent orange over the distant mountains. It was not Chayton. The rider was a young Apache woman named Nalin, dressed in practical, weathered buckskin, her face striking and her demeanor radiating quiet authority. She dismounted without invitation and walked directly toward Elara, who was mending a fence near the corral, the wooden box tucked safely beneath a floorboard in the ranch house. Nalin carried no weapon that Elara could see, only a slim, rolled piece of parchment tied with rawhide. She spoke in Apache first, a rapid, liquid language Elara couldn't understand, before shifting to heavily accented but precise English. I am sent by Chayton. He sends greetings to his wife, Elara Voss. The casual use of the word wife sent a shiver down Elara's spine. It was a term of ownership and connection, yet Chayton had been gone for weeks. Nalin presented the parchment. This is a map. It shows a water source, a spring high in the painted hills. It is pure and plentiful. It is outside the boundary of your deed, but within the boundary of your protection. Elara took the map, her brow furrowing. The Apache controlled the vital mountain passes and high springs. Access to this spring would be a game-changer for Briar Creek, ensuring their survival through the harshest summers. Why does he give me this? Elara asked, her voice deliberately neutral. It is a gift that strengthens my settlement. But what does he ask in return for this bounty? Nalin's dark eyes fixed on Elara, holding a deep, ancient wisdom. Her response was simple, chilling, and finally illuminated the true nature of Chayton's demand, the debt she was now expected to pay. Chayton asks nothing for the water, Elara Voss. The water is for the people on the land. What he asks is for the law, Nalin stated, her voice dropping slightly. The Apache do not trust the territory's laws. But they need protection from the territory's laws. On the west side of your land, a surveyor named Leland has been stealing Apache burial ground artifacts and selling them in Santa Fe. He is protected by the territory marshal, who takes a cut. Chayton cannot touch the marshal without starting a war. But you own the land the marshal rides through. Your lease agreement has a clause about peace and security. Chayton expects his wife, the sovereign of Briar Creek, to use her white man's law to stop the surveyor and end the arrangement with the marshal, without a single shot being fired. Your sovereignty is your payment. Elara stared at the map and then at Nalin, realizing the chilling brilliance of Chayton's plan. He had married her, not for love or companionship, but to gain a legal, unassailable operative inside the enemy's system, an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of a federal deed. He hadn't wanted a wife, he wanted a Trojan horse, and her dignity was the price of entry. Elara felt the cold weight of the task settle over her, a responsibility far heavier than any she had faced before. It wasn't about land boundaries or lease agreements, it was about confronting armed men and systemic corruption, using only the fragile shield of a legal document. She dismissed Nalin with a silent nod, allowing the Apache woman to disappear back into the vast, indifferent landscape as swiftly as she had arrived. Elara spent the rest of the day hunched over the crude map, overlaying it mentally with the official deed's boundary lines. The Painted Hills Spring was indeed just outside her territory, but the route the crooked surveyor, Leland, and the territory marshal, Deputy Silas Crow, used to access the protected Apache grounds ran directly through the westernmost portion of her land, a small, rocky canyon they favored for its seclusion. She realized Chayton hadn't just given her land, he had given her a choke point. Her plan had to be subtle, legal, and absolutely irreversible. Confronting Deputy Crow, a man known for his brutality and deep connections to the territorial government's corrupt land interests, with a rifle would lead to immediate war. Confronting him with angry words would lead to her death. She needed to hit him where he was most vulnerable, his legal authority and his wallet. She could not touch the marshal in his official capacity, but she could certainly touch the trespasser on her private property. By late afternoon, the massive iron gate stood, a formidable sentinel across the canyon entrance. Elara was there, overseeing the work, the wooden box with the deed prominently displayed on a nearby rock, a silent symbol of her immutable authority. As the last support post was hammered in, the sound of horses approached. It was Deputy Crow, a hulking man with a perpetually sneering face, accompanied by Leland, the nervous-looking surveyor. They stopped dead, staring at the newly erected barrier. Crow's eyes narrowed, instantly understanding the message. He drew his pistol, the movement fast and dangerous. "Who in the blazes put this here?" he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Barnaby and Ezekiel stepped back instantly, their faces pale, leaving Elara standing alone between the marshal and the gate. Elara stepped forward, her hands visible, her voice calm. "I did, Deputy Crow. This is private property. It is the western boundary of the township of Briar Creek, which I own. I am merely securing my land." Crow lowered his gun slightly, a cruel smirk replacing his anger. "You're Chayton's bride, ain't you? What, the savage tell you to run his errands?" he sneered, gesturing contemptuously at the fence. Elara ignored the provocation. "I am Elara Voss, the registered owner and beneficiary of this land, Deputy. Your current activity of crossing this private property to meet with a known artifact thief," she pointed at Leland, whose face went ashen, "violates my right to peace and security. Furthermore, your association with him directly threatens the stability of my community, a violation of the lease agreement signed by every tenant here, including the men who just built this fence." She didn't threaten him physically, she threatened his legal standing and the livelihoods of every man in town. If he touched the gate or her, he'd be assaulting a private landowner, and she could immediately evict his entire network of informants and friends in the town, crippling his operation. He realized with a surge of cold fury that she had built a perfect, legal cage around him, leveraging the town's fear of her power against his own lawlessness. He was trapped in the letter of the law he usually ignored. Deputy Crow's face, usually a study in arrogant confidence, was a mask of cold fury and disbelief. He was accustomed to rough justice, to bullets and fear, not to being checkmated by a 19-year-old girl wielding an official seal. He looked at the heavy iron gate, then at the terrified faces of the blacksmith and the lumber owner, and finally back at Elara. He understood that she wasn't bluffing, she held the legal right to crush his entire support system in Briar Creek. If she evicted Barnaby Cobb, the town lost its blacksmith. If she evicted Ezekiel Hayes, they lost lumber for building and coffins. The political fallout from such an act, initiated over a matter of private property rights, would force the territorial governor's office to intervene, and a federal deed made Elara's position unassailable. He knew the cost of fighting the law was infinitely higher than the cost of simply finding a new, less exposed route. His rage, however, demanded an immediate, physical show of dominance. He took a menacing step closer to Elara, his boots grinding the canyon dirt. "You think that piece of paper stops me, girl? I'm the law here. I can arrest you for obstruction, for consorting with Apache hostiles, or simply for breathing wrong." His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Leland, the surveyor, was already backing away, seeing the inevitable collapse of their operation. Elara met Crow's gaze without flinching, the years of silent suppression and fear now completely burned away by the white-hot necessity of the moment. She didn't argue law or morality, she focused entirely on his personal loss. "You are the law, Deputy, but you are not above the law. You can arrest me, yes. But the very moment your hand touches me, I will initiate eviction proceedings against Mr. Cobb, Mr. Hayes, and the owners of the general store, the saloon, and every other business that benefits from a lease on my land." She paused, letting the crushing weight of her threat settle on the men who were listening in horrified silence. "I have the contract signed and notarized. I have the federal deed. You will trade one woman's inconvenience for the economic ruin of your entire township. And you will be seen as the man who did it, all because you wanted to protect a common thief." The mention of the thief, Leland, was the final, surgical cut. It exposed the true, petty nature of Crow's corruption. Crow looked at the faces of the townsmen who relied on him for protection, men who were now looking at him with desperate, pleading eyes, and he knew he couldn't afford to be the man who starved their families simply to protect his side hustle. His power was contingent on the community's obedience, not its ruin. He lowered his pistol completely, the defeat echoing in the sudden slackness of his posture. "This isn't over, boss," he spat, holstering his weapon with a loud, sickening thunk. "You'll wish you never had that deed." But Elara knew it was over. He had retreated from a confrontation with a civilian, acknowledging the superior legal authority of the federal deed. He had lost face, and in the Wild West, that was often a more permanent wound than a bullet. Crow turned abruptly and yelled at Leland, "You! Get your horse and ride. You're on your own. This territory is closed." The surveyor, terrified, scrambled onto his horse and disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving his half-packed tools behind, physical evidence of their guilt and haste. The deputy watched him go, then glared at Alara one last time, a look of pure, concentrated hatred that promised future retribution. He wheeled his own horse and rode away, not through the newly installed gate, but back the way he came, conceding the choke point and the victory to Alara. The two townsmen, Barnaby and Ezekiel, let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding, their fear giving way to a grudging, profound respect for the girl who had just stared down the brutal authority of the territory marshal. They finally understood the full, terrifying scope of the gift Chayton had given her. It was absolute, bloodless control. Alara didn't gloat. She simply instructed the townsmen to lock the gate and bring the abandoned surveying equipment to her ranch. She was not interested in punishing the marshal, she was interested in results for her silent partner. By sunset, she had secured the canyon, dismantled the corruption, and delivered a clear, resounding victory to the Apache without firing a single shot, all through the terrifying power of property ownership. The townsfolk, watching the marshal's retreat and the surveyor's flight, were fully silenced. They had gathered for a wedding of humiliation, but they were now living under a reign of legal terror, utterly dependent on the mercy of the girl they had once scorned, and whose strange, powerful husband was still a ghost. The immediate relief that followed Deputy Crow's retreat was profound, but Alara did not allow herself the luxury of celebrating. She watched from the canyon entrance until the last trace of the marshal's dust cloud vanished, a heavy realization settling upon her. The act of defiance was complete, but the true burden of her marriage had only just begun. She had successfully wielded the white man's law against the white man's corruption on behalf of the Apache, fulfilling the unspoken contract. She returned to the ranch with the surveying equipment, expensive tools that Leland would certainly demand back, a tangible, silent trophy of her victory. She knew Chayton was watching, or that someone reporting to him was. The silence of the desert was no longer empty, it was filled with watchful eyes and high expectations. That evening, as the sun set and the air cooled, Alara left the ranch house and walked a short distance into the scrubland, taking only a single blanket. She sat on a rise where she could see the distant, dark shape of the painted hills, the Apache territory. She knew she couldn't simply ride to Chayton's camp, that would invite a territory raid. She had to communicate her success and her obedience in a way that acknowledged their partnership without sacrificing her own security. She unrolled the blanket, which was a deep, vivid scarlet, a color rarely seen in the dusty browns of the frontier. She carefully draped it over a tall, dead tree stump, letting the wind catch the fabric so it stood out like a brilliant, temporary flag against the deepening twilight. Then, she retrieved the wooden box, carefully took out the land deed, and placed the document on the ground before the stump, weighted down by a smooth river stone. She did not kneel, nor did she speak. She simply stood for 5 minutes, allowing the tableau, the scarlet flag of completion and the deed of power, to convey the message to anyone watching from the distant hills. She was saying, "The task is done. The power you gave me is secure. What is next?" The next morning, the scarlet blanket was gone. In its place, tied neatly to the stump with a piece of rawhide, was a gift, a beautifully crafted Apache woman's knife, its handle carved from bone, the blade sharp and gleaming. More importantly, there was a new message on a small piece of cured leather, written in the same precise English as Chayton's earlier note, but in a different hand, suggesting a shared, educated council among the Apache leadership. The message was concise: the sovereign has performed with honor. The water of the painted hills is open to all tenants who respect her authority. The next payment of the debt is due at the full moon. This payment is for the children. Do not fail us. The note provided no further details, only the looming deadline and the cryptic, terrifying mention of the children. Alara realized the depth of the Apache motive was greater than just artifacts and land access. It was about something deeply personal, something generational. The opening of the Painted Hills water was a gift not just to Alara, but to her tenants. It was a clear demonstration to Briar Creek that their new owner's sovereignty benefited them directly, provided they maintained their loyalty and respect. This act of shared bounty further cemented Alara's authority, forcing the townsfolk to choose between their old hatred and the immediate, life-sustaining benefit of pure water. She announced the new water rights with cool detachment, making sure every tenant understood that the gift was conditional, and that her status as Chayton's wife was the direct channel of their fortune. Briar Creek was now bound to the Apache through Alara, their continued existence depending on the maintenance of this strange, powerful legal truce. As the days crawled toward the full moon, Alara became obsessed with the phrase, "for the children." She used her new access to information, leveraging Jed Kellen, who was terrified of losing his store, to gain access to Old Town records and the general store's archived ledgers. She discovered a dark, unspoken thread in Briar Creek's past. 5 years ago, a terrible diphtheria epidemic had swept through the territory. The white settlement had been devastated, but more chillingly, 8 Apache children from a smaller, separate band were known to have been taken in by the town for treatment, or perhaps, simply to remove a perceived threat of contamination, and were never seen again. The official record showed they died and were buried, but the documents were vague and the records signed by a town council long since scattered or dead. The town had actively covered up the children's disappearance. Chayton's debt was not simply for a past kindness, or current leverage, it was a demand for justice regarding a forgotten atrocity, and Alara, the legal sovereign of the place where the crime occurred, was the only one who could provide it. The anxiety of the coming full moon was a cold, constant knot in Alara's stomach. She knew this was the true core of Chayton's demand, the moral debt that superseded the financial one. The fate of 8 missing children was not a matter for legal maneuvering, it was a demand for truth and closure. The town's cryptic silence about the diphtheria epidemic 5 years prior felt less like forgetfulness and more like a collective, deliberate erasure. Alara realized she couldn't rely on official records, which were clearly fabricated. She needed a confession, a direct link to the crime that still haunted the Apache memory. She shifted her focus from the written word to the living conscience. Her target became Dr. Alastair Finn, the former town physician. Dr. Finn was now an old, broken man who lived in isolated poverty on the outskirts of Briar Creek, his practice long since abandoned after his reputation was tainted by the epidemic's failure. Alara knew he was the key, he was the one who had signed the phony death certificates. Using her power strategically, she didn't threaten to evict him, she cut off his access to the new, clean water from the Painted Hills. The arid summer heat quickly made his already meager life unbearable, creating a swift and immediate crisis that targeted his survival without violence. 2 days before the full moon, Alara rode to his dilapidated shack, carrying a single canteen of the pure spring water. She found Dr. Finn huddled inside, visibly weakened by dehydration and despair. His eyes, sunken and haunted, reflected the deep guilt he had carried for half a decade. Alara set the canteen down, the sound of the sloshing water a cruel temptation. "You signed the papers, Doctor," Alara stated quietly, her voice devoid of judgment, focused only on extraction. "The certificates that said 8 Apache children died of diphtheria and were buried in the town's east field. I know the town lied. I know the truth is why Chayton gave me the land. Tell me what happened to the children, and the water is yours. Keep silent, and you will share the same fate the town planned for them, slow death and forgotten burial." The urgency of the full moon was a ticking clock, and the sight of the clean water was the lever Alara used to force open his conscience. The doctor finally broke. He wept, a dry, rasping sound, the truth pouring out in a flood of shame and desperation. The children had not died of diphtheria. They had been exposed, yes, but when the epidemic hit the white settlement hard, the terrified, panic-stricken town council, led by the then sheriff and Silas Voss's own corrupt partners, saw an opportunity. They didn't want the burden of caring for the Apache children, fearing they were only carriers who would contaminate the town further. They also saw the children as future hostages or threats. The doctor confessed that the council had ordered him to administer a low dose of laudanum, intending to suppress their immune systems until they succumbed to the illness. But they had recovered. They lived, Ilara, the doctor whispered, his confession a bitter bile in his throat. But the council had already dug the graves and filed the papers. They couldn't admit their mistake. So they sold them. Sold them to a traveling prospector, a man who claimed to have a contact in the California missions, promising they would be cared for, or trained as cheap labor. They weren't buried, Ilara. They were stolen. The entire town, her father included, had conspired not to kill them, but to erase them, selling human life for a cheap, temporary solution to their panic. This betrayal, the systemic, cold-blooded sale of children by the very men who had judged her marriage, ignited a fierce, cold rage in Ilara. She now understood the full, profound depth of Chayton's gift. It wasn't just a political move, it was a deep, silent cry for justice against a town built on lies and exploitation. She gave the doctor the water, fulfilling her side of the bargain, but made one final demand: he would write and sign a complete, detailed confession, naming every member of the town council who participated in the crime, including her father, Silas Voss. She knew her power was derived from the law, and this confession was the legal, undeniable proof she needed to deliver to the Apache. As the full moon cast a stark, silver light over the barren valley that night, Ilara rode toward the canyon gate, alone. She carried the signed confession, the wooden deed box, and the new, sharp Apache knife. When she arrived, Chayton was not alone. 20 mounted Apache warriors sat in a silent semicircle, their faces stoic, their presence an undeniable military force. Chayton dismounted and walked toward her. This was not a wedding, it was a reckoning. He didn't ask her for the confession, he merely asked, did the sovereign find the truth about the children of the Tonto band? Ilara pulled out the signed confession, its paper stark white in the moonlight, and handed it to Chayton. She did not speak. He took the document, read the confession quickly, and then slowly folded it. He did not look triumphant, only profoundly sorrowful. His wedding gift had been a demand for justice, and she had delivered. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.